In this video, we will continue on with occupations and their knots. The first listing for the bees is the baker, with the pretzel knot being the first entry. The next is the overhand knot, which appears to be the oldest form of the pretzel, and then a modified figure 8 knot, giving a more sophisticated pretzel. The basketmaker is the next listing with the slath or slarth knot that appears at the bottom of splint baskets. The bell ringer's first entry is the bell ringer's knot, which is the first half of a sheep shank, meant to keep a long end of a rope from lying on the bell tower deck when not in use. For long and heavy rope, 2 hitches may be used instead of 1. To provide a handhold for ringing chimes, yarns are passed through the strands of a bell rope, packed hard and trimmed evenly. These are called sallies, sally tufts, or sally tufting. For the balloonist, the basket of a balloon is toggled to eye splices on the gas bag, so the balloon can be easily disassembled from the basket. Under the blaster, the entry discusses tying a dynamite cartridge that is to be exploded with a fuse. Ashley says that a constrictor knot should be used for this. The bookbinder has an entry for the bookbinder's knot, which is used for sewing pages of a book together. Ashley says that it is identical in form to the left-hand sheet bend. The next listing is a bootmaker, where Ashley gives a good amount of information that is mainly focused on securing thread to bristles. The preferred type of bristles, according to Ashley, were from northern domestic boars. These bristles would be the needles used to sew boots by hand. The thread is twisted around the bristle, and a bootmaker's awl pricks a hole in the thread, and the end of the bristle is put through to secure the two together. Another method involves splitting the bristle before twisting the thread. Entries 180 and 181 show how to secure the loose ends of the thread after sewing. The last entry for the bootmaker is another way of threading a bristle. This method starts the same as was explained in entry 179. It employs the use of a marling spike hitch and a single hitch. The butcher is the final listing for the bees. Butcher's knots are used for tying up boned and rolled roasts, and in the preparation of corned beef and salt pork for pickling. Entry 183 discusses the general structure of butcher's knots. Twine is passed around the meat, and then a simple noose of some sort is made around the standing part of the twine. The noose is drawn up and held taut, and then it is half hitched around the end. This half hitch makes everything secure and is an important feature of the butcher's knot. The hitch is put around the end, not the end through the hitch. Butcher's knots are a variety of binder knots, and without the half hitch, they are called jam knots. Ashley found that butchers use many different knots in their profession because of the fact that the final half hitch makes almost any type of butcher's knot secure. The following butcher's knots that Ashley mentions are only a small sample, and all have the characteristic final half hitch. The first butcher's knot employs a square knot that is capsized into a reverse hitch. Ashley notes that this is the most common and also the poorest of the butcher's knots, as it is likely to slip when being drawn up and occasionally spills. The granny knot is another knot used and is pulled to capsize into 2 half hitches. The packer's knot is known as being the most practical of the bone and rolled roast knots, but not secure enough for a corned beef knot. The next knot is based on the packer's knot, but has one more turn. Ashley says it doesn't help any and was added by someone who couldn't leave well enough alone. Entry 189 is not given a name, but is noted as being easier to tie than the previous knot. The butcher's knot in entry 190 is described as the most common of the butcher's knots. The overhand knot in the end prevents it from spilling when being drawn up. For pickling and corning meats, the noose of the butcher's knot needs to jam enough to hold the meat firmly for the time of pickling. During this time, the meat shrinks, so the knot needs to be occasionally tightened. For this reason, the final hitch is not added until after the pickling is done. Entry 191 discusses the corned beef and salt pork knot. And the best knot, according to Ashley, to use as the meat shrinks is the buntline hitch, which is tied around its own standing part. Entry 192 discusses another corned beef knot that Ashley notes as appearing more complicated than it needs to be, but it holds exceptionally well. Moving on to the C's, the first listing is the Cabinetmaker. Entry 193 discusses how a Cabinetmaker's scroll saw is tightened by twisting a cord with a short stick. The Chandler is listed next and discusses the process of candle dipping. The wicks are tied in a way as shown in the picture. The Carpenter is the first listing of the C's that discusses specific knots. A timber hitch is noted by Ashley as being convenient for hoisting boards since it can't jam and can be easily loosened. A practical way to hoist a hammer is to make a sling with a slip knot and a single hitch. Another way utilizes 2 single hitches. To sling a hammer for lowering, a clove hitch around the handle could be used, but needs to be drawn tight to prevent the handle from slipping out. For installing the sash of a window, which is the movable part, the Carpenter would utilize a sash weight knot. This entry speaks to the weight and cord system of sash windows. Ashley was shown how to sling a plank to be used as a type of scaffolding by utilizing round turns and a final turn passing over all parts to the end of the plank. To sling a plank or joist on edge, Ashley says to make a very loose clove hitch and work it into the desired form. For slinging a ladder to use as scaffolding, a sheepshank knot is generally used. The last entry for the Carpenter is a sash cord hitch. This hitch is used for tying the end of a sash cord in a window sash. The single hitch, half hitch, and overhand knot have all been used for this purpose. The Circus Man is the next listing. The knots Ashley describes for this listing were shown to him by people employed at Ringling Brothers Circus. Entry 204 is a dry weather hitch, which is a clove hitch. It's quickly formed, easily adjustable, but tends to jam if wet. The wet weather or take-up hitch involves a single hitch being dropped over a stake, the end backed, and a slipped half hitch around the standing part. It is easily adjustable when wet and doesn't jam. The crossing knot was used for making a marked-off path for circus goers to follow. The crow's foot was used to stretch the edges of a safety net. The one-length hitch was used on a sidewall pole for the circus tent. The wrap hitch was also used for a sidewall pole, but it was more for temporary use. A quarter pole twist was a temporary hitch used for the quarter pole. The rope passed around the pole a second time before being made fast, as a quarter pole had more weight on it than a sidewall pole. Entry 211 shows a more secure quarter pole hitch. A harness chain anchor was used to secure the end of a chain in the horse tent. The jumper hitch was for quarter poles, as they had no projections to tie to. The center pole hitch was utilized on the center pole of the circus tent. The camel hitch was used for tying up camels and is easy to untie and doesn't slip. Entries 216 and 217 show net pole knots that were used for the poles that stretched the safety net for aerialists. The balancing pole hitch supported a man from the top of a balancing pole during his act. A slip tackle knot was used to make fast almost all apparatus tackles in the circus. The last entry for the Circus Man describes how tent stakes were taken out by means of a lever on wheels and a chain put around the stake. The next listing for the C's is the cook, with one entry discussing how to spit and truss a fowl, which is essentially tying it up for cooking. The next listing is a cooper, which is a craftsman who makes barrels. This listing seems out of place as it discusses the split wood joints used in this trade. Ashley addresses this and says that they serve a purpose similar to bend knots, and so he includes them in his book. Looking briefly at these entries, entry 222 shows the ordinary hoop fastening for common commercial barrels of Ashley's time. Entries 223 through 225 show more elaborate joints used on items commonly used at home. The last listing for the C's is the Cowboy. Ashley was told that a hobble knot was a common range knot. It was used on the legs of a horse to limit the distance the horse could go while unattended. This knot essentially consists of 3 reef knots. The Honda knot is also described as being used by the Cowboy and is based on the bowstring knot. The overhand knot is added to the Honda knot for security, and the standing part of the rope is put through the hitch to form the noose for a lariat. Ashley says that an eye splice is preferred over the Honda knot. Entry 230 discusses how a half thimble was sometimes placed in a Honda eye splice and hammered tight around the rope. An oval thimble was also used. Entries 232 and 233 discuss forming an eye with a braided rope using nails and copper wire. The last entry for the Cowboy is the cinch, latigo, or girth knot that came from South America and reached Western America at the beginning of American ranching. Ashley notes that this is a safer coupling than the buckle on sporting saddle girths and is much stronger. That completes the listings for C, and in the next video we'll begin with the listings under D.